Hi, you guys. This is where we stopped on part one of population ecology. And we were talking about, I'm going to backtrack a little bit, about mark and recapture and how you could capture some organisms, mark them, release them, recapture, and get a percentage of those that were marked to help you estimate the size of the population. So going back now, this question is very important. What are some assumptions to be made when using mark and recapture methods? I mean, you're thinking this is going to work, right? But you have to have made some assumptions that don't always work out very well. And so let's think about what some of those are. The first one is that you have to assume that in that 2-week period that you went back and sampled, there were no new individuals were born or immigrated into the population, and that none died or immigrated. So that population is actually the same size. It's an assumption you make. Does it mean that it's going to be true? Not necessarily. So this is going to affect how correct that estimate is. Okay, so some may have died, some may have moved in. What else? Well, you have to assume that the chances for each individual in the population to be caught are equal and constant. What's that mean? Well, maybe if they're very young ones I had joked about being the dummy that got caught. Maybe they don't have equal chances of getting caught. Maybe the very young ones are very naive and they'll get more likely to get caught. So you're actually trapping only the young ones. Who knows? You've made an assumption that the chances are equal. 3, you've assumed that the individuals are randomly dispersed throughout the population, so that if, depending on where you're standing with your net, that's an okay place to be because they're randomly dispersed. And it's not like you set yourself exactly in the area that they are, and if you had gone 100 yards to the right, you wouldn't have gotten any. So you're assuming this randomly dispersed population. Not always true. We see that when we sample the sand crabs. We have teams of students out there and standing pretty close to each other, and one group will get a bunch and others will get none. And that's maybe 15 feet apart or 20 feet apart. Another assumption is that animals are not affected by their marks. What if, after you put that little band on that jay, they can't feed well and they don't do well and they don't fly, so you're not going to catch them. So you have to assume that it's not affecting them. You also have to assume that they didn't lose them, because if it came off the foot, then you're counting it as one not trapped before and it had been. And this is a picture here, of putting all sorts of sensors on marine mammals and trying to track them. So those are the 5 assumptions that you're going to make, and you kind of have to have faith that some of these will not be met, and therefore your estimate is not 100% accurate, and it won't be. You just have to live with that. Okay, we know that births and deaths are going to affect the population size. So let's say you had a study and you wish to estimate how a squirrel population changes over time, not like the recapture experiment where you just want a shot in time. Now you want to see how it's changing over time, right? You're going to go into spring and into summer and you want to see how is this changing. And you're going to have to take into account some of these birth rates and death rates, and how were you going to do that? So what factors might they consider when determining the population growth rate? So if you want to know whether it's growing or diminishing, let's say you want to really know if it's growing. Let's say you think it's growing. What are the factors that you're going to look at to see what that growth rate is, how they're multiplying and how they're getting bigger in size, that population? What are you going to look at? Think about that for a minute. less than a minute I'm going to give you. So this is a giveaway. It's in your book. An addition, right, is a birth. So if you have more births, of course, you're going to have a greater population. But specifically, and that's what we're interested in, you want to know the number of reproductive episodes per lifetime. Right, you want to know if a mother squirrel can reproduce and have offspring once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, or how often. So it's the number of reproductive episodes. You also want to know the number of offspring that she has every time that she has a reproductive episode. So does she have 3, 4, 5? How many in the nest? You'll also want to know how old is this female. How old is she when she starts having offspring? So she can mate and have offspring at what age? And if you knew that age distribution of the population, you could estimate what that growth was. So you could only do that if you had that item 4 here, which is the population age structure. Like, are they mostly young? Are they mostly old? If most of them are old, maybe they're not reproducing at the same rate, and you'd have to think about that. It's hard, right, to get an accurate number. You'll never get an accurate number, but you're trying to do the best at estimating. What about migration into the population? You want to know availability of the dispersal mechanism. You know, is it easy to disperse? Are they moving in and out? Is there suitable habitat close by that they're going to and leaving or coming in from, right? For this particular slide, coming in from. So is this habitat so great that the neighbors are moving into this area or not? There's subtractions, there are deaths, right? Some of those animals are going to die. How? Accidents. Gosh, have you seen them trying to cross the road? I think I'll go, I think I won't. I think I'll go, I think I won't. And then here comes the car and smush. Accidents. Maybe disease. I know that the squirrels here around my house are scratching a lot. I think that they have ticks. So they do have disease, or could have disease. Predation. So I have foxes that will definitely, I've seen a fox walking in my backyard with a squirrel dangling, with the head dangling on one side of the mouth and the tail on the other, just kind of trotting along with his squirrel in his mouth. And nutrient availability. Do they have enough food or are they starving? And is that why they're dying? And then is there migration out of the population? Maybe you have an area that's easy for them to disperse. Maybe you're close to a freeway and dispersing isn't a possibility. They're not going to cross that. They're not going to cross Highway 17. They're going to stay on that side. So all of this you're going to have to be looking at if you're trying to estimate a population. So obviously when you add more individuals and you subtract, the population's going to grow, right? And this is an example of deer. Deer populations are a problem in many states, and that's because we've removed their predators. We've taken away the bobcats, the mountain lions, and now our deer are surviving and surviving and surviving. Look at this shed here. It's just so many of these. So adding more individuals and subtracting, population grows. Adding fewer individuals, then subtracting, the population drops. So we make charts of this. We want to know what the age structure is, right? We want to know, are they all old and therefore not reproducing as much? Are these young trees, which means that the population is on a rise, for this example for trees. So in this study, the individual wanted to know if the population was growing, stable, or declining for both white oaks and cottonwood. So let's look at the white oak first. This is the age. There's very few that are 300 years old. There's more of them that are 200, and it goes increasing. So the younger, the 50, year-old trees. There's lots of them. So be careful with this, because and if I ask you, is this population growing, stable, or declining? And you take a quick look without thinking about it and you think, oh my gosh, this population is declining. And that is incorrect. I'm going to just put a big X through this, right? Because there's many young trees, many more young trees than older. Therefore, this population is growing. It's on the rise. And as for the cottonwood, young trees, we have none. No young trees. And old trees, yes, we do. But does this indicate that the population is growing? No. This population is probably declining because there are no new young trees. So be very careful with these graphs that might trick you into thinking that this one's growing too. Okay, so ecologists find it useful to determine population death rates. In a population, for example, here of penguins, how likely is it for them to die? How likely is it for them to die in the first 6 months, or in the first year, or on year 10, or on year 12? You kind of want to know that. So to do that, you're going to build survivorship curves, and they're going to show the probability of dying at a given age. And that's very helpful. So you would have age in years here in a big column. This is a life table. And the number of survivors. So let's say you started with 1,000, right? So if they're newborn, you are studying this population and you have 1,000 new births in this population. And then you want to go back and study them a year later. How many of them made it to year 1? How many had a 1-year-old birthday? 324 of them. And this is how you build these graphs, these survivorship curves. So the following slides show you this. 324 baby penguins survive a year or longer. And you keep going. 138 only are going to survive 8 years or longer. 57 are going to survive 16 years or longer. We're getting down there. We started out with 1,000, and we're down to 57. So you end up building these charts, this huge big drop in the beginning. So this isn't to scale here. This should be interrupted like this. 100 and then 10. Oh no, that is correct. Because it's number size out of 1,000, we have 10 and then 10 times and then 10 times that. That is correct. So then a big drop in the beginning. And then we want to know, remember we said reproductive episodes, when can they actually begin reproducing? And then their survivorship drops, and you would have over a space of 15, 16 to 17 years, you'd have this survivorship curve based on their life tables. And you get a good idea of how long they're living, how many offspring they are leaving in their place. So back to Monterey, the Pacific bluefin tuna matures late. It takes 5 years for it to become full maturity so that it can lay eggs, the female. And they live very long. They live from 15 to 26 years if they're not fished out of the ocean. But they're fished extensively. And about 80% of this is consumed in Japan in the form of sushi. And if you look at the Monterey Bay Aquarium guidelines for sustainable fish, you'll see that this is definitely on the avoid list. Do not eat this. So why not? Well, since bluefin tuna are late to mature, they're slow growing and long lived, they're especially vulnerable to fishing pressure. You've fished them out young, that's it. You've done away with all those reproductive years. It could be replacing some of those fish back into the ocean. So it's very different to a faster growing reproductive, more productive species that reproduces earlier. So it takes care and legislation to work through this to see how we can maintain these populations. The Seafood Watch from Monterey Bay Aquarium, you've probably seen it, is an app. It's also a little booklet, but the app is very helpful, that will tell you which fish you're doing best, which are most sustainable, and that's the best choice for consumption, and which is good or okay, and which to avoid. So, Whole Foods too uses this, so they'll put it on their fish saying this is sustainable and this is fish that's best to buy, which is really good. It's a big step in the right direction. When you put these survivorship curves in the form of a graph, okay, just imagine these organisms, a fly. It's going to lay lots and lots of eggs. And of those 1,000, very few are going to survive. They're going to get eaten by other organisms, by wasps, and so very few survive. And so the strategy is lay thousands of those eggs and have very few of them survive, and that way this organism will do okay. And that's type 3. Type 1 is what we are, humans, and large animals that have one offspring. And by having one offspring, they have a huge amount of parental care, and that offspring is going to survive. You're going to take care of it, and it's going to live until it's old and then die. So those are the two extremes. Dying out young is frequent, and few make it, or you have invested parental care, few young, and you make those few survive. And then there's the in-between. Between the 1 and 3 is going to be type 2. Many birds have quite a bit of parental care, but they'll have a clutch that's maybe 6 or 8, or maybe they'll have 2 of these reproductive episodes in a year. So they have more offspring, but they're still taking care of them, and not like a fly that lays them and takes off, and many of these end up dying. So these are survivorship curves. Survive a lot and then die old, survive very little, few make it, and everything in between. As a summary here, it says species that invest little energy raising their young have high death rates among offspring, and few individuals survive to reproductive age. These are interesting to see when you see a moth egg like this, that she lays them all in a neat little row on a leaf, in nice little rows, and then a wasp can figure this out and come and lay her eggs inside someone else's egg. And that's a parasitic wasp. That's what they'll do. And not many will survive. This is a quail egg clutch. So 9, 10, that's sort of the intermediate type 2 curve. Okay, we're going to stop there. This is the end then of part 2. Thanks for visiting.